In this lecture, we'll talk about some basic characteristics of the foreign exchange market that lay the groundwork for being able to apply supply and demand analysis to help understand changes in exchange rates. I'd like to start with a couple of basic questions. What is an exchange rate? We're going to define that. Why would anybody want to trade one currency for another currency in the first place? And then what are the economic consequences of changes in the exchange rate? An exchange rate is simply the price of one currency in terms of another currency. For instance, we could think about the price of $1 in terms of Japanese yen, or the price of €1 in terms of Swiss franc, or the price of one Icelandic krona in terms of British pounds. Why would anyone want to trade one currency for another? Well, either to invest in a foreign country or to buy import goods. To invest in a foreign country requires that you exchange your domestic currency for the foreign currency. To buy exports from a foreign country require you also to exchange your domestic currency for the foreign currency. So these are two reasons why an individual might want to trade in the foreign currency market. Now, if I buy an electronic device made in Japan, likely I'm going to pay as the consumer dollars for that device. I may not physically have to exchange my dollars for yen in order to buy that. But somewhere along the line between the dollars I spend and the yen that the Japanese manufacturer ultimately receives, there is a transaction that converts the dollars into yen. In that case, we would describe that process as selling dollars to buy yen. I might not do that. Most likely an importer who stands between consumers in the US and suppliers in Japan would do that. But that would be one example of why somebody would want to trade in the foreign currency market. Ultimately, anytime an individual buys goods from another country or invests their money in another country, that increases the demand for that foreign currency. For example, during the early 2000s, the country of Iceland saw tremendous economic prosperity. We'll have more to say about that later, but one of the things that happened was that Icelandic consumers, awash in cash from a banking boom and a really unprecedented market rise, began to develop a taste for American real estate. Let's consider an Icelander who buys American real estate, say a condo in Beverly Hills. The Icelandic krona used to purchase the house, or that the Icelandic consumer has in their possession, has to be converted into dollars in order to buy the house in Beverly Hills. An easier way to think about this is that foreign goods can be bought only with foreign currency. So the Icelandic krona must be sold and US dollars bought, in other words, krona exchanged for dollars, and then the transaction in Beverly Hills can be consummated. Again, remember that foreign goods can only be bought with foreign currency. In this case, the Icelandic buyer has to sell their krona and buy dollars and use those dollars to buy the American real estate. Another example of this was that during the mid-2000s, British consumers were attracted to the very high interest rates offered by Icelandic banks. Many British consumers who were facing 3% and 4% rates at home were interested in investing or depositing their banking wealth in the Icelandic banks, which were offering anywhere from 10 to 15% per year on banking deposits. Many British consumers converted their British pounds into Icelandic krona and deposited those krona in Icelandic banks. We would say that the British consumers, sold their pounds to buy krona. Before we begin examining the foreign exchange market and foreign exchange prices in detail, we need to clarify a couple of key ideas. The first is how many krona are needed to buy 1 pound. I'd like to just talk about how we define that and how economists talk about the price of one currency in terms of another. And then I would like to define the words appreciation and depreciation. As your intuition might suggest, appreciation simply refers to a rise in the price. Depreciation refers to a fall in the price. Here, however, we are talking about the price of one currency in terms of the other. So if the British pound increases or appreciates, that's equivalent to the Icelandic krona depreciating or decreasing in price. From the graph on the screen, we can see that historically, over the 2003 to 2009 period, there was a dramatic fluctuation in the exchange rate between the British pound and the Icelandic krona. And like to use this historical example or this historical data to highlight and define a couple of key ideas. The first key idea is the way that I'd like to communicate is the way in which foreign currency prices are written. If you look at the label here, GBP/ISK, the GBP stands for Great British Pounds, ISK is Icelandic krona. This notation means the price of 1 British pound in terms of Icelandic krona. It does not mean the number of British pounds per krona. There's a subtle but very important distinction. So anytime you're dealing with foreign currencies, it's the price of the first, or the price of 1 unit of the first currency, in terms of the second currency. So here, this is the price of 1 British pound in terms of Icelandic krona. From the data, we can see that this price fluctuated quite dramatically over this 6-year period. If we look at the beginning price, that is about 125 krona for 1 British pound. So 1 pound was equal to 125 krona, which I'll simply abbreviate KR. Now, we could obviously take the reciprocal of this or flip this around and ask, what is the price of 1 krona in terms of British pounds? The price of 1 krona, and this is at January 1st of 2003, so to give us a historical backdrop, 1 krona would be equal to 1/125th of a British pound, which works out to be just about 0.008 British pounds. Now, the exchange rate is important if we are wanting to invest in a foreign country or if we're wanting to buy products from a foreign country, which in the case of Iceland, many Icelandic residents during this period of time wanted to do both. On the other hand, we can see that the price changed dramatically, particularly during the 2008 and 2009 period. Again, we'll have more to say on this later, but that corresponds with the great financial crisis. And if we look at the exchange rate, the price of 1 British pound in terms of krona during that period, we can see that 1 pound was equal to about 200 krona. So the pound appreciated over this period and the krona depreciated. We could also write the price of krona in terms of pounds. 1 krona was 1/200th of a British pound, which is 0.005 British pounds. So the 3 key points that I'd like to pull out of this graph are how we define exchange rates and then how we interpret or actually operationalize these exchange rates in terms of the price of one currency relative to another. Now, I'd like to pursue one example here, and that is, what would be the price to a consumer in Iceland of purchasing a Land Rover four-wheel drive vehicle? Well, Land Rover is manufactured in Great Britain, and let's suppose that the price of a Land Rover is 60,000 British pounds. One of the reasons exchange rates are so critical in economics is they determine the price of import goods. In 2003, a consumer in Reykjavik interested in buying this Land Rover would have converted their krona to pounds, sold the krona to buy pounds, and in this case they need to come up with 60,000 British pounds. How many krona does that require? Well, 60,000 British pounds exchanged for krona at an exchange rate of 125 krona per 1 British pound gives us the dollar amount. In 2003, that Land Rover would have cost 7.5 million Icelandic krona. Now, as the pound appreciated over the following 6 years and the krona depreciated, let's suppose that the manufacturer, Land Rover manufacturer in Great Britain, didn't change the price of the Range Rover in British pounds. They maintained that 60,000 British pound price tag. By 2009, when the exchange rate was 200 krona per British pound, that same consumer in Reykjavik would have needed to come up with much more money in terms of domestic currency in order to buy that same Range Rover. In particular, in 2009, that same vehicle selling at the same price of 60,000 pounds would have converted or would have translated into a price using the exchange rate of 200 krona per British pound of 12 million krona. So in this very simple example, we can see that as the British pound appreciated and the Icelandic krona depreciated, from the perspective of the Icelandic consumer, the price of those foreign goods became much more expensive. We'll have much more to say about this later on in a couple of different follow-on lectures, but the point here is that the exchange rates are not simply an esoteric number that don't affect individual consumers. They matter dramatically and very acutely for consumers who buy foreign goods. So just to summarize then what we've seen, the Land Rover selling for 60,000 pounds doesn't change its price in Great Britain, but as the exchange rate between pounds and krona fluctuates, the price that the Icelandic consumer pays for that imported item changes, in this case, changing dramatically. Now, to understand to understand exchange rates requires us to apply supply and demand analysis to the foreign exchange market. To show you how this would be set up, we're going to still consider the price and the quantity, the price on the vertical axis, the quantity on the horizontal axis, but now the quantity is the amount of one particular currency being exchanged in the foreign exchange market. The price is now the price of one currency, so in this case the price of a pound, in terms of another currency. This is a little different than what we're typically used to seeing. We're typically used to seeing the price of some item in terms of our own currency, the price of an iPhone in dollars. But the analysis is no different. It's simply the price of one currency in terms of another. The demand for one currency will still be governed by the first law of demand. We'll have a downward sloping demand curve and an upward sloping supply curve. Changes in underlying consumer behavior can be modeled with changes in supply and demand, and those changes will give us an economic perspective and provide a framework for analyzing and understanding changes in foreign exchange rates. I want to thank you for listening to this primer on foreign exchange rates, defining some key terms and understanding why foreign exchange rates are important for consumers who want to buy foreign goods or invest in foreign countries.